Hi, everyone. My name is Erica Matko, and I am the Coordinated Entry Regional Manager for the South Central Region. Today, I'm going to be doing a quick training on coordinated entry intake notes. Today's focus will be on coordinated entry intake notes that take place after that initial contact with 211 or an access site. Let's get started. All right, so coordinated entry intake notes. When should a coordinated entry intake note be completed? A note should be completed or entered anytime there is communication with the client. For coordinated entry specialists, this would include the initial conversation and anytime the client calls back in to check on their status or update their current housing status. This could also include if the client's current living situation has changed or if their current county has possibly changed. For housing providers and emergency service providers, this would include any time you speak with the individual or household from the time that they enter into coordinated entry up until the time that they exit coordinated entry. Some examples of when a coordinated entry intake note should be completed for emergency service providers. A note should be entered for all attempts to contact the client for a shelter bed opening. A note should also be entered when a client enters shelter. So after the intake's been completed and the client is now residing in shelter. When a note should also be entered when a client exits shelter. The note should also include the client's exit destination. Some examples of when a coordinated entry intake note should be completed for housing providers. A note should be entered for all attempts to contact the client for housing. As a housing provider, you should be attempting to contact an individual or household from the by name list 3 times within 5 days. All 3 of these attempts to contact the client should be documented in the client's coordinated entry intake notes. A note should also be entered when a client has an intake scheduled. Notes should also be entered during the housing search process. So when the client begins searching for housing and they're enrolled into a program, as well as if a housing inspection has been scheduled or been completed. A coordinated entry intake note should also be entered when the client has been housed. This intake note should include the date the client was housed, as well as their exit destination. Coordinated entry intake notes for a trans client whose documents may not match their name in the system. When entering the client's information into the note, you need to use the client's current name and proper pronouns. This is the name that they have instructed you to use, not their dead name. So what is a dead name? A trans person's old name is known as their dead name. When a person transitions and changes their name, the old version of themselves, including their old name, dies. Referring to a person using their old or dead name can be incredibly damaging to a trans person and can severely negatively affect their mental health. You should only refer to the client's current name and pronouns while writing the coordinated entry intake note. If a client is trans or non-binary and their name does not match their old documents, please type the following as a separate note in red if possible. The note should read as follows. Client is transgender, name and gender markers on paperwork and past documentation may not match name in the system. Do not refer to this client by their old name or call them by that name. Client's name is, you would insert the client's current name, and pronouns are the pronouns that the client refers to, and always refer to and address client using that name and pronoun and their pronouns. Other reminders, the date you enter the coordinated entry intake note should always be the date the communication took place. All CE intake notes should be entered prior to submitting an exit request form. Coordinated entry intake notes are extremely important. This is the only way providers know what the current status is of the individual or the household. If the communication isn't documented, the communication never happened. I can't stress this enough. If the communication is not in their coordinated entry intake notes, then really the communication never happened because providers who are looking at those records aren't able to see what's going on with that individual or household. All right, so next we're going to go ahead and take a look at some examples of coordinated entry and take notes here within the training environment. All right, so I am currently logged into the Client Track training environment. When you originally log into Client Track, you'll notice that you originally come to your home screen here. So we're going to go ahead. What I would like to do first is just to show you the different places where you can actually enter in coordinated entry and take notes. There are 3 different places that you can locate those. So the first place you can locate coordinated entry and take notes is from your home tab. If you click on the menu button and you scroll down to by name list, you can search for the client either by their ID or first and last name. Once you've located your client here on the by name list, if you click on the action button here and select, it's the 3rd option down, CE intake notes. This is one place that you are able to read the notes that are already located in here, as well as add an intake note. A second place that you can enter CE intake notes is from the client's dashboard. To get to the client's dashboard from the by name list, if you click on that home tab up there, it's going to bring up the carousel. And the second option in is clients. You're going to click on that. Once you're on the client's dashboard, you're going to notice that the last client record that you were in is automatically going to pop up. So if you need to search for the client that you are entering the notes for, you can just simply click here on the search button and search for that client. But I'm going to be using Fried Eggs to enter my coordinated entry intake note. So the next place that you can locate it is by scrolling down here towards the bottom of their dashboard. You'll see it says, this is Fried Eggs CE intake notes. This is one place, as well as this little box over here can also be clicked. And again, brings you to the full length of the CE intake notes, as well as where you can add one. The third and final place is by clicking on the menu while you're still on the client tab. And on the client's page, you go down to the coordinated entry menu and select that. You'll notice that the 4th option down, coordinated entry intake notes, you can simply click that. Again, it's going to take you to that same place where you can add a note. So the next thing I want to do real quick is show you the different subject lines that you can use for a coordinated entry and take note, and then we'll take a look at some example notes. So you'll notice once you click on the add a new intake note, this is what's going to pop up. It's going to say client coordinated entry and take note. The entry date is going to automatically populate for today's date. You'll notice that it gives you the option to change your subject line. There are many different choices that we have here. If you're a CE specialist, you'll focus mainly on the coordinated entry subject lines. So for a CE triage assessment updated, this would be used if a client would call back in and update their current county for example, or update their current living situation. Anytime a triage needs to be updated, this subject line would be used. CE VSPDAT completed. This is what CE specialists use to complete an initial coordinated entry intake note once a VSPDAT's been completed. Anytime a VSPDAT is updated, you would use the CE VSPDAT updated subject line. CE shelter referrals. This subject line is used if any shelter referrals are just made, typically in our category 2 shelter only enrollment. We also have CE prevention referrals. This subject line can be used if a CE specialist is completing an HP screening, or if possibly additional prevention referrals are sent out. CE client check-in. This subject line can be used anytime it would happen to call back in for maybe just to check on their status, maybe update a phone number, things like that. CE general update. As a regional manager, I typically use this to exit clients when I receive an exit request form. Again, this could also be used with the client check-in if they were to call in and maybe update their phone number. And then the CE quality review edit is used by 211 staff. If you're an emergency service provider, you have the subject line here as emergency service contact, intake, or exit. Again, you can use this subject line for any of those attempts to contact, if an intake scheduled, and when they're exited or housed. Our rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing programs have these following subject lines. So engaging, when you've made contact with the client and you are engaging with them, once they're enrolled, you would use this subject line. Intake's been completed, they're enrolled in the program, they're searching for housing. The rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing first contact, this should be used at that first contact with the client. Maybe this in your note, it could include that you made contact with the client, they're scheduled to come in for an in-person intake on such and such date. And then the rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing follow-up update subject line. This would be used anytime after the client's been enrolled, any updates that are taking place. You don't need to worry about the eligibility documentation subject line. And then the contact attempted, this subject line is new and should be utilized when you are attempting to contact a client for services and maybe you haven't made that contact with them yet. So once you've selected your subject line, you'll go down here to the body of the note and enter your notes. One thing I do want to remind you all of is once your note has been completed, it is extremely important to click this little read only box. By clicking this box, you and only you are able to go in and edit that note. If that box is not selected and somebody else was to open that note, they could potentially edit it. So it's extremely important to make sure you're clicking this read only box. So I'm going to go ahead now and show you some example coordinated entry intake notes, kind of like a chronological order of notes from the time somebody initially called in to 211 or maybe came to an access site, and then the process through like shelter and then being assisted with housing through a mainstream provider. So you'll see here on 10-4, there was an original or initial coordinated entry intake note completed for the client. The client, is interested in Blair, Cambrian, and Somerset counties. It gives us a detailed information or detailed note about what's going on with the client. On 10-4, an emergency service provider made contact or attempted to contact the client. It looks like on 10, a note was entered on 10-5. The client ended up calling back in on 10-4 and is scheduled to come in for an intake on 10-5 at 3 p.m. On 10-7, a note was entered. A rapid rehousing provider reached out to the client regarding possible housing, and the client was scheduled for an in-person intake on 10-10 at 9 a.m. That same provider entered a note as well, stating on the 10th that the client no-showed for their scheduled intake appointment, and that the provider was going to attempt to reschedule the appointment with the client for another day. Another note was entered in on 10-11. It looks like the housing provider was able to make contact with the client and an intake was rescheduled for 10-12 at 3 p.m. On 10-12, the client did show up for the intake appointment for rapid rehousing, and the client is enrolled in that program and searching for housing as of 10-12. So it looks like from 10-12 up until 10-28, that individual or household was searching for housing. On 10-28, the client located a rental unit and an inspection was scheduled for the following day at 10 a.m. Then it looks like the inspection must have went through because the client signed their lease today and will be moving into a rental unit with rapid rehousing funds. An exit request form has been submitted to the regional manager, and that took place on 11-1. So you'll notice that these notes really tell a story about what's going on with this individual or household. It lets us know what happened from the time they entered into coordinated entry all the way up until the time they exited coordinated entry. One thing you will also notice with these notes is that you'll see down here at the bottom, your initials and then your agency initials should be included at the bottom of each note as well. This is important because it allows us to know who created the note and to keep track of notes that are being entered in. So this was our coordinated entry intake notes training. If you have any questions or need further review on information that needs entered into coordinated entry and take notes, please don't hesitate to reach out to your regional manager in your region.